Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 11 running back rankings for the 2024 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm covering all topics related to the running back position, beginning with matchups, talking about which defenses are allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs so that we can identify the most advantageous matchups going into the week. After which, I'll transition into talking about my top 36 running back rankings, talking about each of these players on an individual basis, while also presenting statistics in order to justify these rankings. At the end of today's episode, after talking about all 36 players, I will be going over the rest of season strength of schedule at the running back position, identifying two spectrums of time, weeks 11 through 14, the remainder of the fantasy football regular season, for those of you who are trying to still get into the playoffs, and for those of you who are potentially already secured a playoff spot, weeks 15 through 17, in order to potentially target specific players because of their advantageous schedules and potentially trade for them prior to your upcoming trade deadline. Outside of that, again, there's a lot to cover, so we'll get right into it. If you're looking for my thoughts on a specific player, you could travel down to the description of the video. We have timestamps available there. You could travel to whatever players you have on roster. While you're down there, if you haven't yet already, be sure to subscribe and, of course, click the bell notification button. Besides the daily content, I also live stream every single day on the channel. Later tonight, starting at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, I will be live. If you have any questions, be sure to swing on by. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's go ahead and begin talking about matchups in regards to rushing statistics allowed based on week 6 through 10. As the season progresses, players get injured. Some defenses regress, some offenses improve. Over the course of this entire season, we've seen a lot of progression from these teams. But I wanted to go ahead and focus on the last 5 games, week 6 through 10, or in some of these instances in which teams have had a bye week throughout the span of time, the last 4 games, in terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing running backs based on rushing statistics isolated. So we find that the current strength of schedule, in terms of the most advantageous matchups belonging to teams that are facing the New Orleans Saints, Carolina Panthers, New York Giants, Patriots, Commanders, Cowboys, etc. going into this upcoming week. Again, over the course of today's video, I will reference back to these and talk about these at an even greater overall extent in regards to each individual player taking on these defenses. For example, Nick Chubb, coming off of the bye week, has looked good thus far this season in his overall return, but now has an opportunity of taking on the best overall matchup at the position. Unfortunately, the Carolina Panthers, the New York Giants, they are on a bye week along with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and, of course, the Arizona Cardinals, so we won't be able to take advantage of those matchups, but either way, we want to take advantage of these advantageous matchups because they quite frankly cannot stop the run. Now, on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, we have the Kansas City Chiefs, the Philadelphia Eagles, the Rams, Chargers, Ravens, who have been incredible in terms of their run stop potential. Again, a lot of these teams absolutely haven't allowed a rushing touchdown, much less yardage alone. I mean, the Kansas City Chiefs are allowing less than 4 yards per carry. I think it's like a 3.38 yard per carry average, and there are many teams alongside of them that have been in this overall category. So of course, at times we want to avoid them considering they aren't allowing very many fantasy points via rushing statistics. Now, it's not to say that the running back taking on the Kansas City Chiefs, like Dalvin Cook this week, isn't capable of getting himself receiving upside. I'm just going ahead and specifically talking about the rushing upside potential in regards to our running backs going into the week. Now, with this all covered, let's go ahead and transition into talking about my top 36 running back rankings, beginning with the thumbnail of today's episode, the one and only Christian McCaffrey, who looked incredible on Sunday against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Now, even though he didn't have the most efficient running game, 13 carries for 39 yards, was Christian McCaffrey in every sense of the word. I mean, he was able to accumulate a total of 100 yards based on his receiving production, had 7 targets, 6 receptions, 68 receiving yards, and even though he didn't find himself in the end zone, what was incredibly promising was the fact that he played 88% of the offensive snaps and handled 90% of the running back touches out of the backfield, 19 of the overall 21 touches. Guys like Isaac Guerendo and Jordan Mason only had 1 rushing attempt each, and both of them only played 3 snaps within the game. Christian McCaffrey's back and now has an opportunity of taking on the Seattle Seahawks, who last season in those games had 135 yards minimum against that defense twice, put up 28.4 and 15.8 in those contests. The Seattle Seahawks thus far this season, they are the 7th best matchup as of weeks 6 through 10 in terms of running back fantasy points allowed on the ground, 18.3. We are anticipating a huge performance here out of Christian McCaffrey and hopefully him finding the end zone. Number 2 is Bijan Robinson, who has been absolutely incredible since week 6. For 5 consecutive games, he has had 100 or more total yards. But not only that, he's been able to put up over 20 fantasy points in 4 of the last 5 games. If it wasn't for one of those games being an 18-point performance, again, would have been 5 of the last 5 games with over 20 fantasy points, coming off of a week in which he scored 27.9 in a half PPR scoring format. Half PPR-wise, that is the most fantasy points he has scored within a singular week in his entire career. He is only continuing to improve. This offense continues to rely upon the running game, and especially considering they're taking on the Denver Broncos of all defenses. Again, their secondary has played incredibly well this season. I'm expecting Bijan Robinson to carry the rock many of times this upcoming week, and of course, carry our fantasy teams to another victory. Number 3, we have Joe Mixon. Look, Joe Mixon has been incredible. Like I mentioned every single week, in the healthy games that he has played thus far this season, he has scored a touchdown in every single game. That's 6 consecutive in a row. Now, even though this most recent performance only totaled 90 yards, again, he has been able to get himself over 90 yards now every single game consecutively as long as he has been healthy. This is incredible overall production. Even though he wasn't able to find himself a lot of overall success on the ground, 25 carries for only 46 rushing yards, still had himself 2 receptions for 44, which really did balance his week and get him to that 16-point marker. The fact of the matter is, he's taken on the Dallas Cowboys, which defense incredibly has struggled over the course of this entire season, especially in terms of stopping the run, allowing 18.88 fantasy points within that category. They're the 6th best matchup, and considering that Cooper Rush is the starting quarterback, we should expect a positive game script in the favor of the Houston Texans, and for Joe Mixon to find himself in the end zone once again. Over the course of the last couple weeks, I've put him within entry slips via Underdog, and it's found a lot of success. Now, speaking of Underdog, for those of you who potentially want to go ahead and put Joe Mixon within an anytime scoring overall position within an entry, be sure to travel down to the description and check them out today. At this current moment in time, if you sign up using code Andrew and make that first time deposit minimum of $10, not only are you going to be able to get the first time deposit offer, but you're also going to get my ranking sent to you for my email directly to yours every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season. Weeks 11 through 18, these rankings are by position, by tier, quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, defense, and flex, half PPR, full PPR. So for those of you interested in taking advantage of the opportunity and potentially following some of the overall entries we make over the course of the week, check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility. If in fact you are not eligible based on your current location, or if you use my code or somebody else's code in the past in a prior season, you can always go ahead and find the rankings via Patreon. Links also down in the description. Thank you very much for all the support. All right, let's continue on with the A-tier running back, beginning with Achane, who even though last night did not have himself the greatest overall performance, I mean, quite frankly, that was one of the most boring games that we've seen in quite a while, especially with two offenses that should have been electrifying within the overall purpose. But for 5 consecutive games with Tua Tagovailoa under center, Achane has had himself 5 or more receptions every single game. Now, as of late, obviously, he's been far more productive in comparison to what we saw last night, which in a half PPR only led to 7.7 fantasy points. The 4 prior games with Tua Tagovailoa consisted of 19.5, 26.0, 23.7, 28.1. So he's pretty much a 20-point machine, and especially taking on the Las Vegas Raiders this upcoming week, the 12th best matchup at the position, we are anticipating more overall opportunities for Achane, on top of the fact that Raheem Mostert didn't have a single rushing attempt last night because he has fumbled twice in the last 4 games. The expectation is that Achane getting himself an even bigger role within this offense going forward. Number 5, we have Jonathan Taylor taking on the New York Jets. I mean, look, on his own, Jonathan Taylor has been incredibly productive as of thus far this season. 5 of the last 6 games consisting of 100 or more total yards. Now, this week, they take on the New York Jets, who offensively struggle mightily within the first half, which only gives Jonathan Taylor an even bigger window to find success. Because if, in fact, the Colts are going to be able to take an early lead, they're going to be able to run the ball for the majority of this game and go ahead and impose their will against the 8th best matchup at the running back position, allowing 17.74 fantasy points per game on the ground alone. We've most recently seen the New York Jets allow 127 in a touchdown to Arizona running backs, 128 in a touchdown to Houston running backs, 146 in a touchdown to Pittsburgh running backs. I would anticipate Jonathan Taylor 100 plus yards and hopefully a touchdown within the week, especially considering the New York Jets offense has only scored 13 total points in the first half of the last 2 games. Again, if this team takes an early lead, they're going to continue to run the ball and let Jonathan Taylor dictate their overall success within the upcoming week. Number 6, we have Saquon Barkley. Look, the fact of the matter is Saquon Barkley is a must-start every single week. We know that because we know what his overall upside looks like, but oftentimes we have Jalen Hurts coming in and stealing touchdowns. The last 4 games have consisted of Jalen Hurts scoring 8 rushing touchdowns, and that's the reason why Jalen Hurts is the number 1 quarterback in fantasy, outside of Lamar Jackson. But going forward, if we're going to be in a situation in which Saquon Barkley is going to be donated those touchdowns and he's going to find the end zone, expect a huge performance. Thus far this season, in the 4 games in which he has scored a touchdown, okay, in those 4 games, he has scored a total of 8 touchdowns, and he's averaging 30 fantasy points in those games. In the 5 games in which he hasn't scored touchdowns, he's only averaging 10.9 fantasy points per game. Luckily, he takes on the 5th best matchup at the position, taking on the Washington Commanders. There's a chance that Jordan Mailata, the starting left tackle, returns this week, which continues to improve their running game. Again, if the Commanders are allowing, just listen to the following stats that they've allowed to opposing running backs over the course of the last 5 games. Pittsburgh, 133 and a touchdown on the ground. New York Giants, 99 on the ground. Chicago, 135, 2 touchdowns. Carolina, 86 and a touchdown. Baltimore, 134 and 2 touchdowns. I would assume that Saquon Barkley in the running game of the Philadelphia Eagles will be able to impose their will on a short week within the matchup on Thursday night. Number 7, we have Derrick Henry. Look, Derrick Henry, 10 consecutive games of 1 touchdown minimum. I talked about it earlier with Joe Mixon being on a consecutive streak of games scoring a touchdown. Derrick Henry thus far this season has truly been the poster child of the anytime touchdown via underdog entry. So he is the cheat code in that overall circumstance. But going into this week, taking on the Pittsburgh Steelers, a division rival matchup, again, both these teams trying to vie to see who is going to win the AFC North, we're going to have to wait and see, but this is going to be a competitive one to say the least. The Steelers, again, are an advantageous matchup, top 10 at the position, allowing over 17 fantasy points per game on the ground. They've allowed a touchdown minimum every single game over the course of the last month of the season, but they don't really give up very many yards to opposing running backs. Las Vegas, only 57 on the ground. The New York Jets, 54. The Giants went for 156, but then most recently, Washington, only 55. I'm not really concerned. Derrick Henry is going to get his 80 to 100 total yards. He's going to get his touchdown. He's going to be relevant once again on a consecutive basis. To begin the B tier, we have Kyren Williams, who unfortunately, as of late, hasn't been able to score touchdowns. Now, a lot of those overall instances over the course of the last couple weeks has been either Matthew Stafford being completely blind, the offensive line missing clear blocks, or, of course, Sean McVay just not giving him the opportunity to score. But this upcoming week has an opportunity to get back on track, having not scored a touchdown since week 7 on the ground. Again, they take on the New England Patriots, the fourth best matchup at the position. The New England Patriots, even though they only allowed 55 rushing yards to the Chicago Bears offense was a mess last week. Outside of that, they've allowed over 100 yards and a touchdown to running backs in 6 consecutive games prior to last week. The expectation is that Kyren Williams is going to be able to have himself a bounce back performance here. For those of you who are a manager of him, do not worry. He's going to find himself finding a lot of success within the upcoming performance, especially considering how badly the Rams played last night. I expect them to go back to the basics and continue to run the ball with Kyren Williams to get them back on track. Number 9, we have Alvin Kamara. Look, Alvin Kamara has had himself 5 or more receptions in 7 consecutive games. When we talk about automatic entries on Underdog, that's one of them. If you see him at 3.5, take the higher. It's an automatic. But not only that, over the course of the last 3 consecutive weeks, now that he's had Derek Carr back and they're really progressing in the right direction, he has had 3 consecutive games of over 100 total yards. This week they take on the Browns. Again, regardless of the overall game script, he is always implicated for success. The only risk that there is ever implied with Alvin Kamara is if there is a potential in which somebody else is scoring a rushing touchdown. Now, this most recent week, of course, a lot of their overall scoring was deep yard passes down the field to guys like Marquez Valdez-Scantling. In the event in which they get close to the goal line, which they will, taking on the Cleveland Browns, there will be opportunities for Alvin Kamara. We just have to hope that he finds the end zone. Otherwise, his yardage and receptions alone will still make him relevant. The overall upside is dependent on that touchdown. Number 10 is Jahmyr Gibbs. Speaking of yardage on a consecutive basis, 5 of the last 8 games in which Jahmyr Gibbs has played has consisted of 100 or more total yards. Now, every single game this season has consisted of 70 or more total yards. So every single game, he's getting a minimum of 7 fantasy points just off of yardage alone. Not to mention that he has scored 8 touchdowns in the last 9 games he has played. And even though it hasn't been a consecutive streak of games, if he's able to get himself the yardage that he's typically getting and a touchdown, we're getting a base minimum 13-point player, especially taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars, who are a top 10 matchup, are expected to most likely have Mac Jones this upcoming week. And even though the Jacksonville Jaguars passing defense has played significantly better, they cannot stop the run. Minnesota ran for 144, Philadelphia 168 and a touchdown, Green Bay 148 and 2 touchdowns. I expect one of the best rushing attacks in the National Football League to impose their will with the services of Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery this upcoming week. Number 11, we have Chase Brown. Look, Chase Brown in the last 2 games has had 32 and 22 total touches. Now, again, they went ahead and they signed a running back yesterday. They worked out Leonard Fournette. They just traded recently for Khalil Herbert. But I don't think this impacts the overall workload that we're going to see out of Chase Brown. Again, really, as of late, as a solo running back, he has looked like 2022 Austin Ekeler. That is the kind of production that he is putting forth, coming off of a performance in which he had only 13 carries for 42 yards and a touchdown, but 11 targets, 9 receptions, 52 receiving yards, and 17.9 fantasy points and a half PPR. The first play of the game against the Cincinnati Bengals was an immediate check down in the direction of Chase Brown. Again, this offense has been very potent in terms of giving their running backs opportunities within the receiving game, but as of late, considering Chase Brown has been the only running back implicated within this backfield, it's opened up even more utilization for him within that category in the absence of T. Higgins. Again, less of an option of a potential downfield, continuing to have to check it down considering this offensive line falling apart at times. Now, speaking of him being, an Austin Ekeler-esque kind of player, they take on the Chargers this week. The Chargers, again, are allowing only 7.78 fantasy points per game. But luckily, of course, Chase Brown has his receiving upside. He is still involved with one of the highest scoring offenses in the National Football League, so I have no concern regarding him this week. I expect him to continue to ball out as the RB1 of the Cincinnati Bengals. Number 12, to close out the B tier, we have Josh Jacobs, who's coming off of a bye week, should be completely fresh, but prior to going on his bye week, had 5 consecutive games of over 90 total yards. And in those 5 games, has scored 4 total touchdowns. So again, he was on a streak of success, and going forward is going to continue to find success, especially considering they're taking on the Chicago Bears. I know that the Chicago Bears most recently fired their offensive coordinator, but quite frankly, the offense is they're dysfunctional. The play calling may change a little bit, but the offensive playbook isn't going to change. The offensive line is not going to change. Therefore, this should be a one-sided affair in which the Green Bay Packers are able to impose their will against their division rivals, against the Bears. Again, in this overall situation, I'm anticipating Josh Jacobs to take advantage of a matchup that is, again, allowing 15.33 fantasy points per game on the ground to running backs. I would anticipate a huge performance from him this upcoming week. Number 13 is Kenneth Walker. Look, the last time out against the San Francisco 49ers earlier this season, back in week 6, in that game, Kenneth Walker wasn't very efficient on the ground, and quite frankly, hasn't been very efficient on the ground over the course of the last couple games he has played. But in terms of his overall production in that game, 14 carries for 32 yards and a rushing touchdown, but was saved by 8 targets, 8 receptions, and 37 receiving yards, leading to 16.9 half PPR fantasy points. Now, luckily for Kenneth Walker, his overall receiving utilization has expanded mightily over the course of the season. He has had 3 receptions in 5 of the last 6 games that he has participated in minimum, and taking on the San Francisco 49ers this upcoming week isn't a difficult matchup. They're allowing over 15 fantasy points per game on the ground. Both Bucky Irving and Rachaad White were individually relevant and scored double-digit fantasy points most recently against them. I'm anticipating coming off of the bye week fresh and ready to go for Kenneth Walker to have himself another big performance here for our fantasy teams. Number 14, we have Kareem Hunt. Now, it was announced earlier this week that Isaiah Pacheco will be in his 21-day practice window. He could be practicing as early as this week, potentially tomorrow. We'll have to wait and see. But it does not mean that there is a guarantee that Isaiah Pacheco plays this week. In the event in which Isaiah Pacheco does not play, Kareem Hunt is our number 14. Again, coming off a week in which he had himself over 20 touches again. That's 5 consecutive games in a row in which he has 20 or more touches. Not only that, but coming off of a game in which he had 10 targets, 7 receptions, and 65 receiving yards. Ridiculous production. Now they take on the Buffalo Bills, a matchup that is always exciting between these two teams. Last season, they took each other on twice. In those 2 games, back in week 14, the Kansas City Chiefs running backs combined for 19 fantasy points, 15 carries for 58 and a touchdown, 5 receptions, 47. And back in the 2023 NFL playoffs in week 20, taking on the Kansas City Chiefs, 17 carries for 128 and a touchdown, 21.1 fantasy points combined from their running backs. If Kareem Hunt is expected to be the lone back and there is no Isaiah Pacheco returning this week, expect him to be a top 15 back at a minimum. Number 15, we have Aaron Jones. Now again, he did sustain a rib cartilage injury. Kevin O'Connell, the head coach of the Minnesota Vikings, has explicitly said that he expects him to play this upcoming week. They'll probably give him a Toradol shot. They'll give him the painkiller and the numbing effect, and he'll go out there and he'll ball out once again. He's coming off of a pretty solid week of nearly 20 overall touches and got himself pretty good overall utilization, got himself over 100 all-purpose yards. Unfortunately, hasn't scored a touchdown in the last 3 weeks, and it's mainly because Sam Darnold, once they get into the red zone, is throwing interceptions. Sam Darnold, the last 2 games alone, has thrown 5 interceptions, so that kind of gives you an indicator as to where this offense is going. But this week, they take on the Titans. With Will Levis at quarterback, it gives more opportunities for this Minnesota Vikings defense to cause turnovers and give an opportunity to Aaron Jones to hopefully find the end zone this week. His yardage is going to be there. Hopefully, he's going to be there, of course, dealing with the injury. But as long as he finds the end zone, he can easily be in the top 12 conversation at the end of the week. Number 16, to begin the D tier, we have Breece Hall. Look, Breece Hall has put up 9, 9, and 10 fantasy points in the last 3 games. And the Jets offense in the first half is not promising enough, in my opinion, to imply that he's going to run the ball consecutively in the second half, unless, of course, the Jets defense want to step up and play incredibly well and shut down the Colts offense, which I do believe is going to be tough for them to do. But the Jets offense only scoring 13 points in the first half of the last 2 weeks, 7 in the game against Houston, 6 in the game against the Arizona Cardinals. It really does make me think that Breece Hall probably not implicated for very much opportunity, because he's been efficient when given opportunity. The last 2 weeks, 25 carries for 126 rushing yards, over 5 yards per carry on average. 8 targets, 6 catches, 42, a 7-yard per reception average, but only 9.9 fantasy points per game. So again, if he's going to be a 10-point player and he may have the upside of scoring a touchdown, fantastic. He'll be 10 and he'll turn to 16. But in the event in which he isn't able to score a touchdown, even against an incredible matchup as such, taking on the Indianapolis Colts that, again, they've given up 86 and a touchdown to Buffalo, 110 to Minnesota, 110 and a touchdown to Houston, 159 to Miami, 122 and a touchdown to Cincinnati. Again, all they have to do is just start off hot, or at least put in a couple good drives in the first half, keep this close, and Breece Hall will be relevant for the entire game and can easily outproduce the number 16 overall spot within the upcoming week. Number 17, we have David Montgomery. Look, David Montgomery, 7 of the last 9 games, has had himself 70 or more total yards and 1 touchdown minimum. So as long as he's going to be within that range of 12 to 14 points, again, he's always going to be implicated as a top 20 running back for fantasy purposes. The fact that they take on the Jacksonville Jaguars, which this should be a one-sided affair, as of course the Jacksonville Jaguars run stop defense has been null and void. I mean, as of late, we're talking about giving up 144 to Minnesota, 168 a touchdown to Philadelphia, 148 and 2 touchdowns to Green Bay. I'd assume that David Montgomery will continue his streak of success. They're going to continue to give him opportunity to impose his will against this defense. Number 18 is James Cook. Look, taking on the Kansas City Chiefs defense, it is the most difficult matchup at the position. They're only allowing 6.43 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs since week 6. But not only that, only allowing 3.28 yards per carry on average to opposing running backs. So again, not the greatest overall matchup. But if in fact we're going to get ourselves into a situation in which James Cook is going to be highly utilized within the receiving game, he can be hyper relevant. Going back to last season, week 14 and in week 20 against the Kansas City Chiefs, the running backs of the Buffalo Bills scored 22.6 and 10.2 fantasy points in those two individual games as a combined total. Now, what was present in both of those games was relatively efficient on the ground, but a lot of receiving utilization. One of those games, 5 catches for 83 and a receiving touchdown. The other game, 4 catches for 21. As long as James Cook is going to be implied for a lot of receiving utilization, which he's certainly capable of handling and excelling within, as long as that opportunity is there, he will certainly be relevant in this top 18 conversation, hopefully finding himself in the end zone as well. Number 19, we have Austin Ekeler. Now, I do want to preface, if in fact Bijan Robinson Jr. is going to be active for this upcoming Thursday night's game, again, he just most recently missed week 10 against the Pittsburgh Steelers due to his injury. If we're going to be in a situation in which he's active, I would rank him right here at number 19. Just in the same way in which I would rank Pacheco exactly where Kareem Hunt is, in the event in which Bijan Robinson is available, he would rank over Austin Ekeler, and Austin Ekeler would go down to being an RB3. But if in fact he's inactive, considering it's a short week, Austin Ekeler, again, the last 2 weeks of overall production, 15.8 fantasy points, 17.6 fantasy points, has scored 3 rushing touchdowns in the last 2 games, and they continue to give him opportunity. Even though the Philadelphia Eagles are only allowing 3.76 yards per carry and only 7.22 fantasy points per game on the ground, Ekeler is going to be the goal line back, but not only that, going to have himself receiving upside within the overall equation, which continues to give him an excelled overall outlook within the upcoming performance. Number 20, we have DeAndre Swift. Look, this offense is a complete disaster, but where they need to improve is getting DeAndre Swift the ball out of the backfield in the receiving game. Caleb Williams has been sacked a total of 14 times in the last 2 games. So you would assume getting the ball out of his hands relatively quickly would be smart. Now, when I went back and I looked at this most recent performance in which he was sacked 8 times in this game, DeAndre Swift had true pass sets 12 different times, ran 18 total routes, and only had 1 target, was targeted on 6% of the routes that he ran. Again, DeAndre Swift should consecutively every single week see himself 4 or 5 receptions just off of checkdowns because Caleb Williams needs to get the ball out of his hands. At times, yes, you may need to keep him in, the backfield in order to make sure that they protect him on a blitz, pickup. But oftentimes, DeAndre Swift should be the automatic checkdown in these circumstances in order to protect this quarterback. If, in fact, the receiving upside isn't going to be implicated this upcoming week, it's going to lead to the death of the overall value of DeAndre Swift within this upcoming week. Taking on the Packers, again, it's not a difficult matchup. They're nearly allowing 15 fantasy points per game on the ground alone, 4.58 yards per carry. They've given up 138 and a touchdown to the Detroit Lions running backs, 81 on the ground to Jacksonville, 123 and 2 touchdowns to the Houston running backs, 127 and a touchdown to the LA Rams. Again, they could take advantage of it with a new offensive coordinator. Hopefully they'll look to obviously running the ball more, but specifically getting DeAndre Swift utilization out of the backfield in order to protect this young quarterback. Number 21. We have J.K. Dobbins. Look, J.K. Dobbins with the return of Gus Edwards definitely is going to impact him in terms of his overall opportunity share. But he still had himself 18 total touches, but 55 total yards. Not a great overall look, especially considering Justin Herbert and Hassan Haskins had rushing touchdowns that was stolen away from J.K. Dobbins. Going forward, I expect him to score those touchdowns. Taking on the Cincinnati Bengals is a middle-of-the-pack matchup, but they are allowing less than 3.5 yards per carry, which they've played incredibly well as of late. But the overall opportunity share is still going to be in the favor of J.K. Dobbins. He's still playing 70% of the overall snaps in comparison to Gus Edwards playing 30%. Again, the overall splits are still going to be in his favor, so he will still be fantasy relevant even in an upcoming matchup as such. Hopefully he gets himself that red zone rushing opportunity and they don't bail out on him and bring in a Hassan Haskins to steal it once again. Number 22 to close out the E tier, we have Rhamondre Stevenson. Look, Rhamondre is taking a very difficult matchup. The LA Rams run stop defense only allowing 7.35 fantasy points per game since week 6 is ridiculous. Obviously, they shut down anything that the Miami Dolphins were doing on the ground yesterday. But nonetheless, when we talk about Rhamondre Stevenson, really, he has taken over this backfield at a full capacity since week 8, handling 74% of the running back rushing attempts, 75% of the running back targets, and scoring 86% of the running back fantasy points out of this backfield. Even though he hasn't been highly efficient because the offensive line has not played well, volume is all that is keeping him relevant. And as long as the volume continues to be there, he could always score a lucky touchdown and even be better than number 22 overall ranking. Number 23, we have Nick Chubb, who's taking on the easiest matchup at the position. Now, I do want to preface, Nick Chubb has not looked incredible thus far this season. Is he progressing? Sure. But in the last 2 games, he has had 31 rushing attempts for only 91 rushing yards. That's a 2.93 yard per carry average. Hopefully the week off, getting his body prepared for the upcoming matchup, a Saints defense is allowing nearly 25 fantasy points per game and allowing 5.56 yards per carry on average since week 6 to opposing running backs. Just looking at the production from running backs against the Saints as of late. Atlanta running backs, 175, 2 touchdowns. Carolina, 67, 2 touchdowns. LA Chargers, 73 and a touchdown. Denver, 152, 2 touchdowns. Tampa Bay, 217 and 2 touchdowns. This offense, for the New Orleans Saints at least being more relevant, will keep their defense off the field more often. But nonetheless, Nick Chubb is only sitting at number 23 because it's an advantageous matchup, but he is limited to his overall kind of opportunity share, which is primarily just running the ball. Outside of him getting rushing yardage and hopefully falling into the end zone, this is a pass-first offense. And in the event in which they get into a negative game script, don't expect much out of Nick Chubb in terms of his overall rushing upside because, again, without any utilization within the receiving game, it is difficult to start him. Number 24, we have Tony Pollard. Now, with the return of Tyjae Spears, as we anticipated, Tony Pollard was going to see less of a workload of opportunity. Only had 13 touches this most recent week, having played 54% of the offensive snaps in comparison to Tyjae Spears' 46%. So as long as the backfield overall contributions lead to Tony Pollard touching the ball 13 times, and of course Tyjae Spears getting 10 touches, if this is going to be more of a 50-50 split, especially with Will Levis back taking on the Minnesota Vikings this week. Again, even though Tony Pollard played relatively well overall in terms of his efficiency against the LA Chargers, which was a difficult matchup as well, I believe Tony Pollard will be a lesser option. Again, that is why I have him at number 24 going into the upcoming performance. Number 25, we have Najee Harris. Look, Najee Harris has been great. Again, usually, like I've mentioned in the past, week 6 and 7 is where he takes off. And in the last 4 games, 3 of those games have consisted of him getting himself over 100 rushing yards, and 3 of those 4 games also consisting of him scoring a rushing touchdown. So as long as the opportunity is there, fantastic. But the issue is you take on the Baltimore Ravens. The Baltimore Ravens have, the most yards they've allowed to a singular running back thus far this season is 52 within a singular game on the ground. And that was to Nick Chubb of all running backs. Outside of that, they're only allowing 3.62 yards per carry on average, and only 8.98 fantasy points per game on the ground. So with Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren both implicated to get rushing attempts, again, he is a lesser option within the upcoming performance unless he falls into the end zone once again. Number 26, we have Travis Etienne. Considering Tank Bigsby re-injured his ankle, obviously Tank Bigsby only had himself 2 total touches within the game. Travis Etienne has kind of recalibrated himself to being the starting running back. And in an upcoming matchup against the Detroit Lions, which again, that defense has not played incredibly well in terms of stopping the run as of late. At times, offenses have taken advantage of them. If we're going to be in a negative game script and we may see more receiving upside, especially considering Travis Etienne's only coming off of a game of 1 reception on 1 target, if the Detroit Lions take an early lead, we would anticipate more opportunity through the air, which quite frankly is what we want out of Travis Etienne going forward, especially with Mac Jones under center. Number 27 is Alexander Mattison. Now, during their bye week, they did fire their offensive coordinator, their offensive line coach, and their quarterbacks coach. We don't even know who's going to be playing quarterback for the Raiders this upcoming week. It could be Gardner Minshew. It could be Desmond Ridder if they're trying to ensure that they get the number 1 overall pick of the 2025 NFL Draft. We'll have to wait and see. But prior to the most recent bye week, in week 9, they played against the Bengals. They got completely torched. And of course, we didn't see much of Alexander Mattison. In fact, we saw 50% of the snaps belong to Amir Abdullah. But prior to that game, Alexander Mattison had 4 consecutive games of 17 plus touches. So if we're going to be in a situation in which they'll get back into giving them the ball 15 plus times, even against Miami, he's implicated for a solid volume of fantasy points. Moving on to our 28 to close out the G tier, we have Rico Dowdle. Look, Rico Dowdle, even in circumstances in which he's been in a negative game script, still coming off a week of 15 touches, was relatively efficient in terms of his overall rushing game. All we have to do is stop giving Ezekiel Elliott the ball, especially on the goal line when he's fumbling. If you give that ball to Rico Dowdle, who knows, maybe he scores. And hopefully they're going to continue to address that and continue to give the ball in his direction, even though the Houston Texans are a solid defense and they're going to give the Dallas Cowboys problems throughout the entirety of that game. Hopefully the Dallas Cowboys are not going to shy away from running the ball and of course getting more utilization out of Rico Dowdle within the receiving game. Our number 29 is Audric Estime, a running back we talked about yesterday in terms of the waiver wire pickups. Again, he played 45% of the snaps, handled 82% of the running back rushing attempts, and going into this week, takes on a Falcons defense that is allowing 4.35 yards per carry on average to opposing running backs since week 6. We have heard Sean Payton specifically say he wants to get more work in the direction of Audric Estime, and as long as he continues to get those opportunities, he's really just implicated for rushing upside. He's only ran 4 routes all season long. So he's not going to be implicated for receiving utilization. All we're really hoping for is rushing yards and him finding the end zone within the upcoming performance against the Atlanta Falcons. Number 30 is Jaylen Warren. Look, very similar in which I talked about with Najee Harris. When you take on the Baltimore Ravens, do not expect much within the rushing game. Therefore, if we're going to see more receiving utilization out of Jaylen Warren, it could keep him as an even more valuable prospect within the upcoming week, even though he is coming off of a game in which he had 16 total touches. Again, that's 3 consecutive weeks of 10 or more touches within this offense with Russell Wilson under center. I mean, again, 14 carries, 66 looked great, 2 receptions, 29. But if we're going to get ourselves into a position in which he's able to catch the ball 4 or 5 times out of this backfield, he'll be even more relevant in comparison to where he was last week. Number 31, Tyjae Spears. Speaking of relevancy out of the backfield, even though they're setting him up on screen plays to get negative 10 yards, again, all we care about is that they're giving him opportunities. Coming off a week in which he had 10 touches in comparison to the total in which Tony Pollard only had 13. As long as the workload is kind of pulled off of the shoulders of Tony Pollard, we have another potential relevant option as an RB3 going into the upcoming performance against Minnesota. Moving on to our number 32, we have Tyler Allgeier. Again, every single week implicated for rushing attempts, potentially a couple receptions, and maybe steals a rushing touchdown. This most recent performance did in fact score a rushing touchdown, but then they called it back, and then Bijan Robinson, the play after, scored. For those of us who had Tyler Allgeier playing, again, you got that extra 6 points taken away. Otherwise, he would have had another consecutive week of scoring a rushing touchdown, which is certainly within the realm of possibility this upcoming performance against Denver. Then we move on to Jerome Ford. Now, this is not someone that I've talked about as of late very often, but considering they're taking on New Orleans, and the last time out, he outsnapped Nick Chubb back in week 9. If we're going to be in a situation in which, of course, Nick Chubb isn't going to be given the vast majority of overall opportunity, much less play the most out of all the running backs on this team, if Jerome Ford is going to get himself maybe 6 to 8 potential touches within the game, especially those within the receiving game, could still be relevant in a top 36 capacity. Then we move on to number 34, Tank Bigsby. Again, dealing with an ankle injury, was limited in terms of his overall usage, only had 2 rushing attempts in comparison to Travis Etienne's 11. Therefore, I think it's a lot more serious. There could be a possibility in which Tank Bigsby is not even active within the upcoming performance. And if in fact that is the case, it elevates the overall ranking of Travis Etienne far beyond where I currently have him at number 26. Then we move on to our number 35. We have Gus Edwards. Again, he is still going to be implicated for 10 to 12 touches every single game. Obviously, very little utilization within the receiving game, so all he's really going to need is rushing yardage and hopefully a rushing touchdown. Otherwise, he's a 5 to 6 point player within an upcoming performance. And then to close out today's episode, we have Braelon Allen. I'm going to hope that the New York Jets really lean in on the running game this upcoming week, especially considering they took on the Indianapolis Colts. Like I talked about earlier with Breece Hall, really they haven't given Breece Hall enough opportunity to be fantasy relevant on a consistent enough basis, but they're taking on the Colts, the 13th best matchup at the position, allowing over 15 fantasy points per game on the ground. Again, they've allowed over 100 yards to opposing running backs in 4 of the last 5 games they have played. So in the event in which this offense wants to pound the rock this upcoming week and of course dictate the game on the ground, they can certainly do so with Braelon Allen. All right, that's going to cover in terms of my top 36 running back rankings. Let's close out today's episode in regards to the rest of season strength of schedule at the running back position. So I've gone ahead and consolidated the overall information to 2 spectrums of time. First and foremost, weeks 11 through 14, then we have the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, the Giants, the Browns, the Texans, the Dolphins, etc., with the most advantageous schedules going forward based on fantasy points allowed by each individual defense. Now again, I've mentioned this over the course of the last couple of days, but I want to continue to harp on this overall opinion. For those of you who are in a position in which you believe that you are already going to make the fantasy playoffs, I would like you to go and trade for players like Bucky Irving, Rachaad White, Tyrone Tracy, or James Conner. All of these players are associated with offenses and backfields that have advantageous matchups at the top 7 rankings going forward. And even though all 4 of those players that I just mentioned have bye weeks this upcoming week, that is why I want you to go after them. If you're in a position in which you do not need to win this week or can give away a little bit of value and take the risk of having a player that you're trading for on a bye, you should do so, because a lot of the teams in your league who may have Rachaad White, Bucky Irving, Tyrone Tracy, or James Conner are probably in a kind of flustered position. They may not have the availability of that running back, therefore they may not give them a chance to win this week, and they could be statistically eliminated from their playoffs. So you would want to go and take advantage of their desperation trading for those players. Now, again, you could trade for a guy like Nick Chubb, again, coming off of the bye week, has himself an incredible strength of schedule going forward. I don't love the overall, production of what I have seen from Nick Chubb thus far this season. Therefore, I'm not suggesting him. Trading for someone like Devon Achane or, potentially Joe Mixon as the number 4 and 5 ranked players for the rest of the fantasy football regular season, very difficult to accomplish, but certainly can try to do so. But overall, again, those are the 4 players that we are primarily focusing on because you could take advantage of the desperation of teams in your league who do not have their services this week and certainly need someone to fill in a running back. So you could even give them a lesser running back in this overall conversation and take advantage of their desperation. Now, in regards to some of the more difficult matchups for the rest of the fantasy football regular season, again, the Carolina Panthers and Chuba Hubbard, with Jonathan Brooks most likely returning sooner rather than later, it may be a good time to ship off Chuba Hubbard right now. Even though he's on a bye, it may be difficult to move him, but taking on Kansas City, Tampa Bay, Philadelphia, not a great overall position for the upcoming future. Same thing with, J.K. Dobbins in the return of, Gus Edwards, may not be a good look to potentially start him against Cincy, Baltimore, Atlanta, and Kansas City in the next 4 weeks, especially if you're trying to make the fantasy playoffs. So be sure to keep this in mind in regards to your potential trades upcoming. Now, for those of you who have potentially already secured yourself a fantasy playoff position, if you're looking forward to weeks 15 through 17 in bringing home the chip, this is how you do it. First and foremost, you're trading for Josh Jacobs. Again, Seattle, New Orleans, Minnesota is as good as it gets. Obviously, trading for Saquon or Bijan is incredibly difficult to do. The Raiders' offense, again, is so volatile that I don't even want to trust Alexander Mattison in that circumstance. Kamara would be difficult to trade for. James Cook would be difficult to trade for. Perhaps, if in fact Travis Etienne was to take over this job rest of season, and there is no implicated Tank Bigsby, New York Jets, Las Vegas, Tennessee, not bad matchups. But Aaron Jones, coming off of 3 consecutive weeks of not scoring a touchdown, could trade for him. Taking on Chicago, Seattle, and Green Bay, great overall matchups. But again, Tampa Bay still in this conversation. Arizona still in this conversation. So the idea of trading for Bucky Irving, Rachaad White, of course, James Conner, still hyper relevant. Just looking at their schedule, James Conner takes on the New England Patriots and Carolina Panthers. He will get you to the fantasy championship in week 17. He will take on a tough Rams defense, but considering how incredibly well the Arizona Cardinals have played as of late, I would assume that James Conner could potentially capture you a fantasy football championship when it's all said and done at the end of the 2024 season. All right, these are my suggestions. Again, these are some of the more difficult matchups coming up forth. Again, in terms of the fantasy playoffs, you might want to avoid Najee Harris, Nick Chubb, stuff like that. But, this is just rushing statistics isolated. Again, San Francisco having a difficult slate of schedule doesn't matter because Christian McCaffrey is implicated for 6 receptions in a game and obviously is, associated with one of the highest scoring offenses in the league, and he's matchup proof. So that is irrelevant. But some of the more, kind of volatile running backs might want to be careful with that. Either way, this covers today's video. Thank you everybody for watching. I'll be back tomorrow talking about wide receivers. I'll be live later this afternoon starting at 7 p.m. PST. If you have any questions, be sure to swing on by. Thank you everybody for watching. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.